questions are concerning grades, and there was a question about what does pass-fail mean for IEP students. So pass-fail is going to be just a measure of whether the child generally passed, meaning I would suspect, without looking at any code of conduct otherwise or school policy otherwise, that a pass is going to be a D or above. And so instead of getting an actual grade, if your child gets D or above, then that child has passed. So if it's a fail, then it's a fail. And so what it will look like for a child with an IEP, I'm thinking that this question might be referring to measurable goals. Well, first and foremost, depend on what that goal is. So when I think about children, for instance, or clients I have that might have speech and language as a part of their IEP, or part of their goal in the IEP, and part of what they need to do is meet with the speech and language therapist in order to, get their phonics correctly and pronounce certain letters of the words. While that the pass-fail is going to look different because the child may not be able to meet with a speech and language therapist twice a week the way that they were meeting with them beforehand when they were in school twice a week. So I don't expect that the pass-fail is going to be as rigorous as it would have been in just like the measurable goals to be as rigorous as they were when everyone was in school. Exactly what that will look like for each child with an IEP really just depends on what that goal is, if this is what the question is referring to, what that goal is, and whether that goal is something that can be met through the online learning, or whether that's a goal that is met with the help of a specialist, like a physical therapist or an OT specialist. But at the end of the day, I would expect pretty a broad definition of what a pass looks like. Just considering the situation, I would not expect the schools to be that hard and difficult in their grading for kids with IEPs when it comes, especially considering the situation. And the fact that this virtual learning is difficult for all students, but it can be even more difficult for kids with IEPs depending on what the disability is. Will the parents have input about whether a school does pass or fail? So my initial thought was no, because the school board is going to be the one deciding whether the school implements a pass-fail system, unless I'm understanding the question wrong. And I think about that because I have a child who's in college, and as a college student, she can decide whether her class is pass or fail, or whether there's going to be a grade. So if that's the question, then that is going to be a question for the teacher, whether you would rather have a grade for the class versus a pass or fail. But if your question is just generally whether the parents can have any input as to whether the school in general implements pass fail for the kids, then that would be a no, because that's it's going to be a school board decision. If my child was behind on IEP goals before school closings, how will they be assessed to determine whether they can advance to the next grade? So part of that is going to be there. To me, that's multi-layered, in part because I'm wondering how far behind they were, and whether we're talking about behind on IEP goals as of January before school was closed, or behind on the IEP goals from August, or maybe from last school year. So just taking it one at a time. So if they're behind on the IEP goals, excuse me, and they were behind last school year, maybe by April or May. So then they opened up in August, September, already behind on the IEP goals. Frankly, that's a separate issue, and that's a due process issue. If they're not meeting their goals, or it could be a due process issue if they're not meeting their goals, and this because of either how the IEP is written, or because the teachers are not following the IEP, that could just be a separate due process issue that would have been a due process issue regardless of the school closures. If the question was they're behind on the IEP goals around January, February, right before the schools begin to close. And how will they be assessed going forward to determine whether they're advancing to the next grade? I would expect a pretty liberal understanding and construction of what pass means, especially considering their, you know, the child was behind on their goals, working towards the goals, but still behind on the goals. And now we have school closures. So now the child doesn't even have access to specialists, maybe a one-to-one aid, uh, obviously no face-to-face interactions with the teacher. So I would expect this, if that's more of the situation, then I would expect the child to still be able to advance as long as they're still continuing to show some progress and some level of activity through the virtual learning system. That's a trick a little bit. Okay, so can a school be retroactive and require previous enrichment packets to be completed as a part of mandatory learning in order to have the child advance to the next grade? So the long and short of it is yes. If the child is behind on their IEP goals, because this question actually came in a way to where I'm thinking it may have been the same child. So if a child is behind on their IEP goals, and let's say, especially if the child just got behind in January, relatively recently, then, and the school is now closed, they sent home enrichment packets. If those enrichment packets are going to help the child meet their annual goals that the schools are getting measured by anyways, then yeah, they can now make that a requirement. And I say that because initially, I think the schools were when the school was initially closed for 2 weeks, I think the schools were operating on the assumption that this is a 2-week closure, we're going to go back to school and everything's going to get back to normal. As opposed to operating on the assumption that it's 2 weeks, but that 2 weeks is still significant. So we should still do whatever we need to do. Now that the schools know this is going to be our life for the next 30 days at least, yeah, in order to allow that child to meet the annual goals, they can require that. Mainly because if they're now requiring what was previous enrichment, what was previously considered an enrichment packet, and the parent wants to fight them on it, saying, well, that was enrichment, it was enrichment. If that enrichment would have been the same or similar material the teacher would have already sent anyways as a grade to help the child meet their goals in order to advance to the next grade, then it's going to look like the parent and child are not cooperating, and it's more on the parent and child, not on the teacher. Because now the teacher has positioned herself to say, look, I tried, I gave this out. It initially was enrichment. We really, it was a fluid situation with school closings. And once I realized we were out for another 30 days, then I decided to make it a required learning. And so then it sort of, as a lawyer, I'm thinking it then shifts it back to the parent to then explain why the child did not complete the packet. So and again, I think it's because schools started out assuming 2 weeks and we're going to go back. So let me just sort of fill in the time for them and give them something to do. And then once they realize this is going to be our life for the next 30 days, they realize something else had to change. But yes, they definitely can make it mandatory, especially if the enrichment packets are the same material or very similar material to what the teacher would have given them anyways in order to meet the annual goals. So if a child doesn't meet his IEP goals, can he still be on target to graduate? So I'm going to assume this child is a senior, or just hypothetically, let's just assume this child is a senior. would say if I was representing that child, then yeah, I would argue for him to still graduate because of a number of reasons. This is unprecedented. No one was prepared for it. This was certainly not prepared for virtual learning. And if something can be shown that the child was steadily trying to meet the goals, but just didn't quite meet the goals, it wouldn't be fair. It just wouldn't be fair, quite frankly, to then say, no, you can't graduate because school was closed. You know, you didn't have access to everything that you normally had access to. So I would say if this child is a senior, specifically, if he doesn't meet his IEP goals, can he still be on target to graduate? Yes, because the reality is, and I know just from prior clients, schools, if they need to, schools can waive certain requirements, graduation requirements even, and certainly some sort of goal requirement in order to allow the child to graduate. And I would expect that in a situation like this, with COVID-19 being the reason, that yeah, the child should still be able to graduate.